Good evening. I hope you're doing well. I'm Dr. Sid Webb, and I'm going through another episode of Insights on Philippians with you. And tonight, or today, whenever it is, we're in Philippians chapter 2, verses 12 through 18. And this is a great passage to take a look at it, and I'm looking forward to getting into it with you. And as you have heard already, we are taking a look at Philippians from the perspective of the approach I take in my book, Awake from Bible Slumber. And so on the cover, we have the sleeping penguin. Tonight, our goal is to wake that penguin up and get that penguin into the Word and understanding what's going on. So there's a wakeful penguin for you. And we should all be wakeful penguins, right? So Philippians chapter 2, verses 12 through 18 says, "Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Do all things without grumbling or disputing, that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world, holding fast to the word of life, so that in the day of Christ I may be proud that I did not run in vain or labor in vain. Even if I am able to be poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrificial offering of your faith, I am glad and rejoice with you all. Likewise, you also should be glad and rejoice with me." Well, as you know, we've been talking about the different approaches I take in the book about how to take a passage and come to understand it. If you really can't get a grip on it, kind of like what are some techniques you can use to actually crack open the passage and get something out of it? Well, the irony is I've worked through the list of passages that we're preaching. I have basically taken Philippians 2, 12 through 18 and thought, this one's a little tougher. This one is not coming to me quite as quickly as some of the other ones did. And so the other day I was thinking, well, you know, when you're having trouble cracking open a passage, the first thing you should look at, or at least one of the first, is the issue of context. Like, what's the context behind the passage? And if you can do that, then you can really make it come alive. So I was thinking about context, but we have a problem with the word context because the word context starts with the letter C. And as you know, in my book, being the seminary graduate I am, I alliterate. So I cannot use context. I've got to find another word. Well, it just so happens that we have the word setting, which is very closely related to context. And the idea behind setting is we're going to take a look at the start from the perspective of the biblical, historical, literary, cultural, and immediate context of the passage we're looking at. And when we do that, it's amazing how the passage will come alive and how we can understand it better. So in our list of words from Awake from Bible Slumber, as you know, they all start with S. You've heard that many times now. And we have setting down there, the biblical, historical, literary, cultural, and immediate context. And so that's critically important. I don't think anything is more important than context when it comes to understanding the Word of God clearly. And so when we think about context, I'm going to put this up here because I think this might be very helpful for you to see. You have the verse, and then around it, you have the paragraph. You have the chapter of the book, you have the book and the author and the historical setting of the book. For example, Philippians in the Roman colony Philippi, and we have the Apostle Paul writing, and he's writing to a very Roman-influenced colony there in Macedonia, Greece. So there's a history behind it. They're going to be going through persecution, and so that's one of the dynamics behind the book of Philippians. We have a testament, the New Testament. This book is one of the epistles, which is a fancy word that means letters, one of the letters that we have in the New Testament. So we're in the context of the early church now. We have the entire Bible surrounding the book. How does it fit in with the context of the whole Bible? And then within the cultural setting. And we know that in Philippi, it had a very distinct cultural setting. So all of these things can come into play when we take a look at a passage and we try to understand it. And so I want to show you how that works tonight. And I've chosen an interesting example of a couple of verses, not out of Philippians, but out of Luke. And I've heard this first one preached quite a bit. It's interesting. I've heard it actually preached a lot because it fits well in the missionary context. And he said to them, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. Go your way. Behold, I am sending you out as lambs in the midst of wolves. Carry no money bag, no knapsack, no sandals, and greet no one on the road. So it's an interesting passage to preach. We definitely preach about the laborers are few, that God is looking for laborers. You hear this preached all the time. But occasionally I will hear somebody preach and make some kind of dogmatic statement about the last part of the passage, which is don't take a money bag, don't take a knapsack, no sandals, etc. Well, one of the challenges with this section here is that later in Luke in chapter 22, Jesus said to them, but now let the one who has a money bag take it, and likewise a knapsack. And let the one who has no sword sell his cloak and buy one. And you're like, which is it? You know, we've got contradictory passages. And the truth is, it's not really contradictory. The context of each verse and each section will explain to us what's going on and how to apply it. So in Luke chapter 10, it's a case where earlier in the ministry of Jesus, he's sending his disciples out 2 by 2, and they're going on, in military terms, a TDY, temporary duty. They're going out to these villages and they're proclaiming, and it's going to be a quick trip. It's going to be a rapid reaction kind of trip where they're going to go see the response and then move from there. And so they don't need to be burdened down by a bunch of stuff. Just basically take your backpack and go hike. Well, in Luke 22, now that we're getting near the end of the ministry of Christ, in fact, there's only 24 chapters in Luke. And so basically we're coming up on the crucifixion. So right before that, he's wanting the disciples to know, hey, you're going to be in it for the long haul, and it's not going to be easy. And so you need to prepare for the long haul. You're going to have a permanent change of station, if you will. And so you need to take things appropriately because you're going to have to provision yourself for a longer period of time. So the context in each one of these fits what the verse is saying and helps us understand what's going on. There's not a contradiction. It's just a different setting, a different context. Well, now let's come into the book of Philippians. And so what I'm going to do with this passage tonight is I'm going to show you how the passages come alive. First of all, we have the context of the book of Philippians, the whole book itself, and the message Paul wants to give to them. And then what I think is really interesting is when you look at the specific parts of this passage by virtue of the context or setting, you're going to see some interesting things come out. And I'm going to show you that right now. So in Philippians chapter 2, Paul says, therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence. So we have a setting here, which is this. The people have been very faithful and they've obeyed, they've been obedient, and they did that when Paul was there. But now we have a context where Paul is absent, and it's a different situation. So they don't have the apostle right in front of them, guiding them. They have to do it because they know they need to do it, but without him breathing down their necks, if you will. And they're told as well that now with him being gone, they're going to have to really be diligent to, as it says, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. So they're going to have to do this. And then it says, for it is God who works in you both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Now, I'm not here to give you a long sermon today, I promise, but I do want to dig into this for just a moment because we have a very controversial verse. Controversial in the sense that people argue about it. So one thing about context is context answers a ton of questions in the scripture. A lot of times context will answer the question for you. And then there are times when context actually gets people debating and discussing. And that's why God invented the coffee shop for times like that, right? So he says, work out your own salvation. Well, what I wanted you to see is in the context, the setting here, it's present tense. And the people have a track record of obeying the Lord until now, and of doing the right thing. And it says, it is present tense God who works in you to will and to work for his good pleasure. So this is not a case where they have to go and do some kind of works to save themselves, to bring about salvation, but they have to be faithful, being saved, being redeemed before the Lord. They have to work that out. And so there's different ways to translate that, but the idea is that you're going to, as one translation says, continue working out your salvation with awe and reverence. Another one says, carry forward your own salvation with fear and trembling. So it's the idea of carrying through to completion the salvation you have. So I'm not trying to preach a sermon, but I just want to say their current situation is that Paul is not with them, and God wants them to be faithful and to continue on. And so that is the setting of these people. So it's good. I mean, these are great people, and they love the Lord, and so the idea is carry on with that, keep pushing through with that. All right, now we're going to come to the next part of it. And I think there's an interesting thing related to setting here. Do all things without grumbling or disputing, that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish, in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world, holding fast to the word of life. So it seems like they're holding fast. A couple of things about their current setting that I think are very important to acknowledge. Number one, they're in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation. So if you would imagine that the first century that the church was in, the early church in the first century, was very similar in many ways to what we're going through now, I think it will help. There's nothing we're going through right now that they did not go through back then. And we can learn from their lesson because it was a rugged time for them. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I'm going to assume that there was grumbling and disputing at times in this church. Now, how extensive, only God knows. There's no church around that's immune to grumbling and disputing. It's just human nature. And apparently there was some there. And so he's warning them not to let that get past them, to basically watch that and be careful about it. So there's an interesting insight to the possibility that grumbling and disputing were rising up in this church and it needed to stop. So that's something to consider in their setting. Now, I'm going to go backwards on you here intentionally, and I'm going to have to get myself out of the picture. Even if I am to be poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrificial offering of your faith, I am glad and rejoice with you all. Likewise, you also should be glad and rejoice with me. So at the very end of this passage, Paul says, even if I am to be poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrificial offering of your faith. Okay, so a couple of weeks ago, I believe it was, we talked about the ifs and how important that detail was. So I want to share with you here that the literal translation of this is, but if even I am poured out. And it's basically the idea that Paul is expecting to be poured out for his faith. Now, what does it mean poured out? Well, in the context or setting of the ancient world at the time, there were ways that they would offer sacrifices by offering what's called a drink offering. And sometimes they would have these objects where basically they were hollow and they had an opening at the bottom and they could pour the liquid down there as an offering to the quote unquote gods. Paul is saying the drink offering here is going to be my blood being shed as a sacrificial offering. So he's not quite there yet, but he's in the status, it's present tense, and it's certain to Paul that it's going to happen and it will happen. And so this is what he will do for them. So he is in the status right now. He is in the context or the setting of knowing that he is going to give his life in a sacrificial way. And in AD 67, that will happen because the Emperor Nero will order him executed, his head will be chopped off, and Paul will die. So in AD 67, it comes true that he is a sacrifice and he dies. And he knows that that's going to happen. So he is in the position at this moment in time of knowing that will be his destiny. But what's really interesting in this passage, and it comes right before that, I think this is incredible. I have to share it with you. That Paul said, so that in the day of Christ, I may be proud that I did not run in vain or labor in vain. In the day of Christ. In other words, the day will come when the day of Christ comes. And Christ will return and Christ will judge. And there will be the judgment for those who have sinned, but there will also be the judgment of reward eventually. And in this day, in the day of Christ, when we rejoice with Christ, Paul will realize that he did not run in vain. And so what we have here in the setting is that his ultimate eternal setting, his context, his status will be that of one who will be honored because he was faithful to the Lord and he carried forth the gospel, and God honored that. Now in 2 Timothy chapter 4, he says, for I am already being poured out as a drink offering and the time of my departure has come. What's interesting about that and what's significant is the fact he says the same type of thing as in Philippians, except Philippians is not the last chapter Paul wrote. The last chapter that Paul wrote that we have on record is 2 Timothy 4. And he says, I'm about to be poured out as a drink offering. So he will go through suffering, and then they will execute him. That execution will happen just like that. And all of a sudden, he'll go through that quick transition where he's in the presence of God. And he has an eternal destiny that is now coming to be realized. So that's not so bad after all, is it? So I think it's interesting looking at Philippians chapter 2 that context or setting predominates overall, and we realize that in our lives there are different contexts, there are different settings, there's different periods we go through. And for Paul, that will be the case. He has led these people, he has mentored them, he has discipled them, he has left them now, but he knows that the day will come when he will face judgment, and then he'll transition immediately into the presence of God, that permanent change of station that he will have, and then someday so that will they. And so in the context of our time now, the commandment is for us to be faithful and to continue to work as a result of the salvation we do have, and to complete that and to carry it through successfully to the end. It's been said, I'll have to find the specific stats for you sometime, maybe next time, but that there aren't that many people that are named by name in the Bible. It's a little over 1,000, I think. And out of that, we have only a few do we really know what their final destiny is, whether good or bad. In other words, did they finish well? And the number that I've heard, only about a third are said to have finished well. So Paul is telling these people, hey, be faithful to the Lord and finish well, and end up in the status with the Lord permanently in eternity, knowing that your labor was not in vain. It's just a fantastic thought. So I think context really comes to the fore here in Philippians chapter 2. It shines, it motivates, it inspires us. And I hope this has inspired you as well. So thank you all, and we will see you later. Take care. God bless.